She was my neighbor, 12 steps away, and one confession from ruining everything. I never thought something as simple as stepping out to check the mailbox would change the rhythm of my evenings. That's when I first noticed her, not in the grand, cinematic way movies like to show, but in something quieter, almost ordinary. She was standing on her porch across the street, watering her plants, the sun dipping low enough to paint her skin in amber tones. She didn't see me at first. She was focused on the way the water trickled over the edge of the clay pot, her wrist moving slowly, her shoulders relaxed in that way people only manage when they're at home, safe. She was older than me, that much was obvious. Lines touched the corners of her eyes, not in a way that aged her, but in the way that spoke of laughter, of years lived with intensity and stories untold. She carried herself with an elegance I hadn't seen in women my age. She wasn't trying to be noticed, and maybe that was the very thing that drew my eyes toward her. The world around us seemed hushed. Cicadas buzzed lazily, and the scent of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air. I stood there with a handful of letters I wasn't even reading, watching her tuck a strand of dark hair behind her ear as if the movement were part of some unspoken ritual. Then it happened. She looked up, and for the first time, our eyes met. Just a flicker, one heartbeat of a moment, but enough to catch me off guard. Her smile wasn't deliberate. It was the kind of smile you give when your guard is down, when you've caught someone watching and don't quite know how to respond. Small. Unintentional. But it stayed with me, echoing longer than it should have. I walked back inside, letters forgotten, heart oddly unsettled. I told myself it was nothing, just a neighborly glance, a polite acknowledgement across the distance of 2 yards and a narrow street. But as I closed my door behind me, I realized something unsettling. I was already curious. Already wondering who she was when no one was watching. Already questioning why that simple smile felt heavier than most conversations I'd had all week. It was such a small thing, but it was the beginning. And beginnings have a way of sneaking into your life when you least expect them. The second time I saw her, it wasn't through chance, it was through routine. Morning light had just begun to stretch across the street, warming the neighborhood in pale gold. I was locking my front door when I noticed her again, stepping down her porch steps with a bag of letters and bills pressed against her side. She paused at the curb, squinting slightly in the sunlight, and for the first time, I caught the delicate rhythm of her life, quiet, unhurried, yet heavy with something unspoken. I offered a wave, casual but lingering. She returned it, hesitant at first, but her lips curved just enough to suggest warmth. That was how it began, small, polite gestures that carried more weight than either of us would admit. Days later, I borrowed sugar. A cliché, yes, but necessity has a way of disguising itself as coincidence. She opened the door in a simple cream sweater, her hair loosely tied back, a faint trace of perfume in the air that clung to the edges of memory. She laughed softly when I asked, the kind of laugh that sounded like it hadn't been used enough lately. Her eyes softened when she handed me the jar, fingers brushing mine just slightly, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, but it left a warmth I carried home with me. From then on, our paths kept crossing. At the mailbox. By the hedges. Once, as we both reached for the same package that had been delivered to the wrong address. Each time, conversation grew a little longer, though never too long, like we were testing the air between us, carefully measuring how much closeness was safe. I noticed the way she tilted her head when she listened, genuinely present in a way most people aren't anymore. Her voice was calm, but behind it was a hesitation, like she was holding something back. She had that quiet grace that made even the simplest words feel deliberate. And yet, there was vulnerability too. A subtle shift in her expression when I caught her eyes for too long, or when silence stretched just enough to feel heavier than it should. I began to sense that she lived with a kind of restraint, a self-imposed distance that made her both intriguing and untouchable. But despite her carefulness, despite the years between us and the invisible lines society likes to draw, there was no denying it, something was building. Something fragile, unspoken, yet undeniable, woven into the smallest exchanges, the tiniest of smiles, and the fleeting brushes of skin against skin. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something that wanted to become. The night it rained, the air smelled of earth and wet pavement. It was one of those sudden downpours that silenced the street, leaving only the soft drumming of water against rooftops. I'd stepped outside to pull in the trash bins, but before I could, I saw her. She was standing on her porch, arms crossed lightly, watching the rain fall as if it were speaking to her. I almost turned back inside, something about the moment felt too private, but she noticed me, and instead of closing herself off, she tilted her head toward the dry patch beneath her porch light. An invitation without words. I crossed the street, shoes splashing in shallow puddles, and joined her under the roof's shelter. For a while, we said nothing. Just the sound of rain between us, her breath faintly visible in the cool night air. She leaned against the railing, hair slightly damp from the mist, her sweater clinging softly to her shoulders. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual, touched with something I hadn't heard before, maybe weariness, maybe honesty. "I don't let people close anymore," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the streetlights blurred by the rain. "It's easier that way. Safer." Her words caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what had made her choose me for this fragment of truth, but I stayed still, giving her space to continue. "I've made mistakes," she went on, her fingers tracing the wet wood of the railing. "Loved people who left, trusted people who didn't deserve it. And somewhere along the way, I decided silence was simpler than disappointment." The vulnerability in her tone was sharp, like a crack in carefully built walls. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the small space between us, but instead I matched her honesty with silence of my own, listening, truly listening. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she admitted with a soft, self-conscious laugh, glancing at me for just a moment. That glance lingered. It wasn't a request for pity. It was an unguarded question: "Can you hold this without breaking it?" I swallowed, my chest tight with something I couldn't name. "Maybe," I said gently, "you just needed someone to hear it." For the briefest second, her expression softened, and the tension between us changed. The rain, the dim porch light, the quiet honesty, it all wrapped around us, making the moment feel heavier, closer, more dangerous. That night, something shifted. She wasn't just my neighbor anymore. She was someone I wanted to protect, someone I wanted to know beyond the carefully drawn lines she had built. And though she didn't say it aloud, I knew she felt it too. For days after that night on the porch, she disappeared. Not in the literal sense, her light still flickered on at dusk, I could hear her front door open in the mornings, and once I caught sight of her bringing in groceries, but it was different. She avoided me. Our chance meetings at the mailbox stopped. The warm waves across the hedges vanished. Even her smile, the one that had once lingered unspoken between us, was gone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. That I had read too much into the rain-soaked confessions. But the truth gnawed at me: she had opened a door for just a moment, and then slammed it shut. The absence of her presence made the street feel colder, emptier. It wasn't until nearly a week later that I found her again. I was walking past her house, the evening heavy with the scent of lilacs blooming along the fence. She was on her porch, folding a throw blanket over the back of a chair. She froze when she saw me, her expression taut, almost guilty. For a moment, it felt like we were strangers again. "Hi," I said softly, careful not to intrude. She hesitated, then gave a short nod. Her hands gripped the fabric a little too tightly, knuckles pale against the soft material. Silence stretched, long enough for me to consider walking away. But then she spoke, her voice firm but uneven. "I shouldn't want you." The words landed like a confession and a warning all at once. They were heavy, shaped by fear, by rules neither of us had written but both of us knew existed. She looked away immediately after saying it, as though ashamed to have let it slip. I stood still, heart hammering, trying to measure the distance between what was right and what was real. But something in me refused to let her retreat into those walls again. I stepped closer, not invading, but enough that she could hear the steadiness in my voice. "But you do." Her head snapped up, eyes locking with mine, wide with a mix of shock and undeniable recognition. For a long moment, we stood suspended in the quiet evening air, the world reduced to just that truth hanging between us. She didn't argue. She didn't deny it. Her silence was louder than words could ever be. And in that silence, the boundary between us cracked, not fully broken, but fractured enough for something dangerous, something tender, to slip through. That night, I realized the rules she clung to were the very things pushing us closer. A week later, I found myself in her backyard, kneeling beside a broken fence post. It wasn't planned. She had mentioned in passing that the wood was rotting, and before I could second-guess it, I'd offered to help. She hesitated, but eventually nodded, as if denying me would only draw more attention to the tension already thick between us. The evening was warm, the kind where shadows stretched long across the grass, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle. I worked with the hammer while she steadied the panel, her hands gripping the wood close to mine. The closeness was simple, necessary, and yet every inch of space between our arms felt charged. At one point, her hand slipped. Our fingers brushed, her skin soft and cool against mine. It was so brief that she could have ignored it, pretended it hadn't happened. But I felt her stiffen, her breath catch just slightly. Her eyes darted toward mine, and in that single glance, everything unspoken between us flared to life. I didn't pull back. Neither did she. The moment stretched, our hands so near that the smallest movement would have closed the distance completely. My chest tightened, not just with desire but with restraint. I wanted to hold that touch, to keep it, but I knew pressing further might break the fragile balance we'd been walking on. She cleared her throat, withdrawing her hand as though the wood itself had burned her. "Careful with the nails," she said, her voice steadier than her eyes. It was an excuse, a shield, but her cheeks held the faintest flush even in the fading light. I nodded, though my heart still raced. Every movement after that carried a quiet awareness. When she bent to pick up another piece of wood, her shoulder brushed mine. When I passed her the hammer, her fingers lingered a fraction too long. None of it was deliberate. None of it was innocent. By the time we finished, the fence stood solid again, but the air between us was fragile, trembling with the weight of all the things neither of us had said. She thanked me softly, her eyes lowered, her hands clasped as though holding herself together. I wanted to reach out, to take those hands, to tell her she didn't have to hold everything in. But instead, I simply smiled, offering her the dignity of distance. And as I walked back across the grass, I knew the truth: we hadn't touched, not really. But it was the almost touch, that fragile hesitation, that felt more intimate than anything else could have. It happened on one of those evenings when time seems to linger. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, the air cool after a late summer breeze. I had been on my porch when I noticed her light still glowing across the street, soft and golden against the dark. Something in me wanted to ignore it, to leave her in peace, but my feet moved before my mind could stop them. When she opened the door, she looked surprised, maybe even a little conflicted. Her hair was down, framing her face in loose waves, and she wore a navy cardigan wrapped tightly around her as though she were protecting herself. I almost apologized for disturbing her, but she stepped aside instead. "Come in," she said softly. Her living room smelled faintly of vanilla candles and the warmth of brewed tea. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, filling the spaces between our hesitant conversation. We talked about nothing and everything, about the weather, about books half finished, about how silence sometimes feels safer than words. But as the night stretched, our voices grew quieter, more vulnerable, the pauses between them weighted with what neither of us dared to admit. At one point, she sighed and leaned back against the couch, rubbing her temples. "You make this harder than it should be," she whispered. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. The truth was already there, humming in the air between us. When her eyes met mine, they weren't guarded anymore. They were tired, yes, but also open, as though she was finally done fighting herself. Slowly, almost as if testing the waters, I shifted closer. My hand hovered, then rested lightly on hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and moved closer still, her shoulder brushing mine. And then, without warning, she leaned forward, her arms slipping around my waist. For a heartbeat, I froze, afraid that moving too quickly would shatter the fragile courage it had taken her to cross that line. But when her cheek pressed against my chest, when I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat against mine, something inside me unraveled. My arms wrapped around her, not possessive, not demanding, just holding. She was warm, trembling slightly, her breath soft against the fabric of my shirt. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. No words, no promises, just the relief of finally letting go of restraint. It wasn't passion that defined that moment. It was something gentler. A surrender, an exhale. Two people who had been circling the edges of something dangerous finally letting themselves fall into the quiet safety of each other's arms. The night we first embraced left a mark on me that sleep couldn't erase. I woke the next morning earlier than usual, drawn by some quiet need I couldn't name. The world outside was hushed, the street bathed in the pale blue of dawn. Mist clung to the lawns, and the faintest chill kissed the air. I made coffee, strong and simple, and before I even realized what I was doing, I found myself crossing the street again, 2 mugs in hand, carried like an offering. She was already outside. Wrapped in a long gray cardigan, she sat on her porch steps with a blanket draped loosely across her lap. Her hair was still a little tousled, her face bare of anything but honesty. She looked up at me, and in that moment, she didn't seem surprised to see me. She just smiled faintly, as though she had been waiting. "I thought you might like this," I said, holding out the second mug. Her fingers brushed mine when she took it, warm against the cool morning. She inhaled the steam slowly, closing her eyes for a brief second, and then nodded. "Thank you." We sat together on the steps, the silence comfortable this time, filled not with hesitation but with quiet certainty. The rising sun painted the sky in strokes of pink and gold, spilling light over the street we had both walked 1,000 times, though never quite like this. Her knee brushed against mine under the blanket, and neither of us moved away. That small touch, almost nothing to anyone else, carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. I felt her lean slightly, the edge of her shoulder resting against mine, and the world slowed down around us. For a long time, we didn't speak. And when we finally did, it wasn't about rules or fears or the boundaries she had once tried to draw between us. It was about simple things, the smell of the jasmine creeping along her fence, the way the morning light touched the houses in soft gold, the quiet beauty of a world just beginning to wake. She set her coffee down beside her, her hands folding in her lap. "You know," she said softly, "I keep waiting for this to feel wrong." Her eyes searched mine, uncertain but no longer afraid. I swallowed, feeling the truth rise in my chest. "And does it?" Her pause was long enough to matter, long enough to carry the weight of every reason she had to pull back. But when she finally answered, her voice was steady. "No. Not with you." Something inside me loosened then, a knot I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I reached over and laced my fingers through hers. She let me, her hand fitting into mine like it had been meant to rest there all along. We didn't kiss that morning. We didn't need to. The intimacy wasn't in grand gestures but in the ease of sitting side by side, sharing warmth, sharing silence, sharing the beginning of something we had both resisted but no longer denied. As the sun rose higher, I realized what we had wasn't about forbidden longing anymore. It was about finding peace in a place neither of us had expected, 12 steps apart, across 2 porches, in the quiet truth of a morning we would never forget.